Thank you, everyone, for joining the Colorado Para Town Hall. My name is Patrick von Kaiserling. I'm the Senior Director of Communications at Para. And we're excited to welcome everyone who's joining us online, on the phone, and on social media today. So, we're here to give you an update about our recently released 2021 annual report, as well as provide some important updates about Para. Most importantly, we're here to answer your questions, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. First, let me introduce our panelists. Joining us are Para Executive Director Ron Baker and Chief Investment Officer and Chief Operating Officer Amy McGarity. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Patrick.
So, if you're just joining us, welcome. We're hosting today's event on the web, social media, and via the phone to reach as many members and retirees as we can. And let us go over a few of the basics of participating on each of the platforms. If you're watching us online, you're all set. But if you'd like to dial in, you can do so by calling 833-380-0713. That number again is 833-380-0713. And we'll be taking your questions in a few minutes. If you're on the phone and have a question for Ron or Amy, press *3 at any time to be placed in that queue. Again, press *3 at any time to have a question on the phone. And if you're on the website, you can type a question below the video player box. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, type your question into the chat box. And in case you need it, a full recording of the town hall will be available on copara.org/townhall. So let's go ahead and get started with our annual report. We're here to discuss how 2021's annual performance was and talking about some of the highlights in the annual report. So the full report will be available or is available on copara.org. There's also highlights available on copara.org/snapshot. And that brings us to our first question. And Karen would like to know, how is Para doing and how dependable is Para? So Ron, maybe you could give us some highlights of 2021.
Thank you for the question, Karen. As PVK answered, I am Ron Baker. I am the honor of being the Executive Director of Colorado Para. Para's financial situation coming out of 2021, and measured as of the last day of the year in 2021, is we're making progress towards full funding. It was a solid investment year. The demographics played out very much like we expected, related to the changes the board made in assumptions going forward. So we are on a path to reaching full funding in the time frame that the General Assembly set with the pension reforms that were passed in 2018. Again, that goal was to be fully funded in 30 years from that date. So that is a 2047 date. So it is a time to get there. We are making progress, but it's a long journey going forward. To answer your question, is Para doing well and are the benefits secure? Yes, they are. Again, there are changes inside the system passed through that pension review or that pension reform legislation that modify contributions and the amount of the annual increase, which I imagine we will talk further about in your questions, to keep Para on this path of being fully funded by 2047. But thank you for the question, and to everybody out there who's taken the time to listen to Amy and I, we are very excited to have a chance to answer your questions. So hopefully we can get to a number of questions and answer anything you need to know about Colorado Para.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at Para's investments for 2021. Amy, can you give us some details on Para's investment performance?
Sure, thank you, Patrick. First, I just thought it might be, I maybe should take a moment and introduce myself briefly. I am, as Patrick mentioned earlier, the Chief Investment Officer and Chief Operating Officer for Colorado Para. I've been with Para, I've had the honor of working for Para since 2010. I came over with the Denver Public Schools retirement system merger. So I'm a long-term Colorado Para employee, and I've been the Chief Investment Officer since 2017. So with that, let me just take you through some stats as it relates to our investment performance. The slide in front of you shows those details. But for the year ended December 31st, 2021, Para's investment portfolio earned a return of 16.1% net of fees, surpassing its benchmark return of 13.7%. We are a very long-term investor, so it's important to think of how our long-term returns are. And over the past 10 years, the fund has earned an annualized return of 10.9% net of fees versus its benchmark return of 10.1%. The value of the total fund increased to $65.6 billion in 2021, up from $58.3 at the end of 2020, and our funded status at the end of the year was 67.8%.
Thank you, Amy. Why don't we go ahead and move on to some of our questions now? Nora has some concerns over inflation and wants to know, is there help available for para sustainability, and are we working with the government?
Thank you, Nora, for the question. PARA's annual increase amount is set in statute and is currently set to pay this July at the end of this month at 1% for all of our benefit recipients who have met the eligibility to receive it. We do obviously understand that inflation is running higher than that right now, and that is meaning that annual increase is not keeping up with inflation. But the annual increase was never intended to be a keeping up with CPI. It is an annual increase that is put forward inside PARA statutes. We as an organization, to modify that, the PARA board can't modify that, PARA staff cannot modify that. That is a decision of the General Assembly. The cost of paying additional increases in an annual increase, a higher percentage, has a cost. There are 123,000 benefit recipients that an annual increase of that has a long-term compounding effect to PARA sustainability. So in terms of whether the PARA benefit structure can be modified to address this window of high inflation, simply would have to be done by the General Assembly, and that does come at a cost to PARA's long-term funding. In terms of what PARA can do as an organization, is trying to do, especially for our retired members who are on the line, is we are really working hard for those of you who are in ParaCare to continue to reduce costs to the extent that we can, knowing that healthcare is a large component cost of retirees' health care situation in retirement. But in terms of the other goods and services that are experiencing high inflation, I know gas prices going up, although they appear to be dropping a little bit. Just the higher inflation end of it, we are all in this boat, unfortunately, together there, and the increase amount of 1% cannot be modified, certainly by PARA staff or by the PARA board. That would take a decision by the General Assembly.
All right, and speaking of the General Assembly, we have Fred on the line with a question about the state's $225 million payment to PARA. And Fred, you are live with CEO Ron Baker.
Good, thank you very much. Yeah, my question is concerning a couple of years ago when the state did not give PARA the $225 million that it annually does. Has that money ever been returned to PARA, and was it done with interest?
Thank you for the question. You're correct that right in the heart of the pandemic, or at least when it started, maybe not the heart of it, the General Assembly was needing to set a budget, and the forecast looked very dire, especially where the markets were at. So the General Assembly suspended in 2020 the payment of the direct distribution of $225 million to PARA. In 2022, at a recommendation of the Pension Review Subcommittee of the General Assembly, there was a bill introduced to pay back PARA, to make whole that missed payment, and as introduced, with interest. Through the course of the 2022, that bill worked its way through the General Assembly, and the paying back of the interest component of it was removed from the bill, and there was so that aspect, to answer your question, no, that is not being paid back with the interest that we would have earned on that amount. But then again, if you take a look at 2022, they were passing a bill in May of 2022 that we would have been looking at pulling investment returns in a negative cycle. So it makes some understanding as to why they did not want to necessarily deal with interest, because they weren't sure what over the last couple of years our returns would be. But the bill was passed. PARA did receive on July 1st $380 million additional from the 225 coming in. So they backfilled the payment of the $225 million. They will and kind of preloaded $155 million of it for next year. So in next year's cycle, they will reduce the $225 million by the amount that they of the additional dollars coming in, with some additional dollars taken back related to investment earnings. So the PARA came out of the process with additional dollars that we didn't have before, which is fantastic, and I think shows a bipartisan support for the para membership. The bill, again, it went through the politics of starting at one place and ending in another, but in a bipartisan manner. The House passed it overwhelmingly bipartisan. In fact, the Senate passed it 35-0. So I think it shows the commitment of the General Assembly to para to try to make up that payment. Is it every dollar that you could have hoped for? No, but was it more dollars than the zero we started with? Absolutely, and that is politics. And again, para is in a better place because of the passage of that bill.
Thank you
Right.
very
As
much.
a reminder, if you are on the phone and would like to be placed in the queue, please press *3 and your question will be placed into the queue. We have an online question from James. How could para benefits be modified to better keep up with inflation like Social Security? Maybe push back the deadline for para to be fully funded. And Mr. Baker, that sounds like a question for you.
That is a question for me. Certainly, that would be a conversation of the General Assembly. Is that if the General Assembly were to determine that they wanted to push back the period to reach full funding, they could. Certainly, increasing the amount of the benefits paid to retirees comes at a cost. If you recall back to the pension legislation and reforms that were passed back in 2010, coming out of the great financial crisis, the single most expensive piece of para's benefit was the compounding 3.5% annual increases. So it is because our increases do not change years. So if you get an increase in this year, it is now in your base, and the next increase is based upon that. Is an expensive component of the plan. The General Assembly would need to do an analysis of what the cost of that would be and come to an agreement that extending the period for para's full funding is in the best interest of the state of Colorado. But it is something that the para board and the para staff cannot do unilaterally. It will take a conversation at the General Assembly. But it's all plan design. To your question, could it be done? Yes, but every one of those comes at a cost, and the cost of paying down para's unfunded liability. For all of our employers out there who are paying additional employer contributions to pay down the unfunded liability, if you extend that time, it increases the amount of time that they're paying additional dollars on member contributions, and we are not getting to a point, to be honest with you, that will allow our employers to pay less into the system so they can use those dollars in other places. Money is fungible, so every dollar that comes to para to pay down unfunded liability is a dollar that is not being used somewhere else. And so those are the conversations that would need to happen at the General Assembly as to what is the best use of those dollars coming forward. But it is a plan design element that certainly would need the General Assembly's approval. Para and the para staff and para board do not set the benefits, and they do not set the contributions. They simply administer the plan that's been put in place by the General Assembly.
Right. Thank you. We have a call online from Marilyn regarding interest rates. And Marilyn, you are
Yes.
now live in our town hall.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I noticed that my daughter-in-law gets 7% interest on her retirement. She's a teacher also. And there's such a discrepancy between what she gets and what we get on our retirement plan. I have to wonder if maybe someone else needs to be looking to improve this situation.
Okay. A little bit of losses to what plan teacher that she's getting 7% interest guaranteed on her investments. Certainly the para plan design is to give a 3% interest on member contributions year on year. That is a number that the para board does have control to within the bounds of 0 to 5%. Again, that is increasing the amount of the dollars in a member's account. We then match those dollars as part of the plan design going forward. So I'm very interested in an account that is guaranteeing a 7% interest rate to anybody. But yes, the para account does give 3%, and the para account does give a matching amount to it of 50% if a person is not benefit eligible, 100% match on contributions if their person were to refund if they are benefit eligible, which is a very healthy matching amount of contributions inside the para plan design.
Okay. Our next question is from Dennis, and he has a question about the windfall elimination provision. And House Bill 82 was introduced before the House of Representatives in January 2021 to tackle WEP, or the windfall elimination provision, and he's wondering what has happened since then.
Well, thank you for the question. That is a yearly, age-old question as to what can be done on the windfall elimination and the provision and the GPO. Those are, for all retirees out there, know those impact what Social Security will pay you based on what you've earned inside PARA. The problem is the bill gets introduced and it tends to languish over this one problem. It's to pay more in Social Security is an expense, and the federal government has not come up with a compromise as to where those additional dollars to pay for giving more of a benefit out of Social Security would come from. So each year a bill similar to that is introduced. I would think and each year it's sort of languishes might be too strong a word, but it doesn't move forward as they cannot come to an agreement as to how to pay for the additional cost of providing Social Security benefits beyond what is currently being offered. Again, they are reduced if you have a PARA account. Certainly understand our retirees and spouses of retirees, when a member passes away, are impacted by that decision at a federal level. But that is why the bill has not gone further, as they cannot come to an agreement on how it will be paid for.
And Ms. McGarity, we have a question for you regarding the stock market. Debbie would like to know what the impact of the current stock market is on PARA investments.
Well, Debbie, thanks for that great question. The PARA portfolio is designed in a strategic fashion to outperform over long periods of time. What that means is we're not trying to time the market. So in essence, we're invested in generally every asset class that the PARA board has designed the portfolio to invest in at all times. And that strategic asset allocation, as we call it, is designed to outperform over long periods of time, decades, not years. And it's generally designed to achieve, right now, a 7.25% return over those decade measurement periods. So what that means for today's market is we are exposed to public markets as well as the private markets, so are experiencing some volatility in our near-term as we are invested in those markets. However, again, we are invested over the long term in a very, very diversified portfolio of public market stocks and bonds, as well as private markets such as private equity, real estate, and other alternative investments. So again, a diversified portfolio that is designed to achieve returns over the long period of time. For example, earlier in our comments, I mentioned our 10-year return of 10.9%. So in any given year, we will experience volatility, but not trying to time the markets, especially from an asset allocation or strategic perspective.
Okay. And our next question is from Anne regarding Ben & Jerry's divestment. Why is the board making political decisions instead of financial decisions? PARA has investments in Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Colombia, and other anti-democratic governments.
I'm going to let Amy take
Okay,
that.
I wasn't sure, sorry. No, this is a super question, and we get asked a lot. So as you can imagine, PARA has hundreds of thousands of stakeholders, if not more, that are interested in how we invest the portfolio. And generally, all of those people do not share the same perspectives. So the PARA board has a statement philosophy on divestment. And generally, what it says is we choose not to divest unless mandated to by the legislature or the federal government. So in the case of the Unilever question or the Ben & Jerry's question, that is based upon Colorado statute, and it's called anti-BDS, or anti-boycott, divest, sanction, and it's generally companies that have removed operations from Israel for political reasons, and that's what it says in Colorado statute. And so because that is in law, we are required to divest of companies that meet that criteria. Now, for example, Ben & Jerry's has been highlighted as a company who has ceased operations in Israel, and thus we should divest of their parent company, Unilever. And so we have added Unilever to the board's anti-BDS list, and are engaging with Unilever at this time to see whether or not we need to actually divest or cease investment in that company. That process is ongoing, but it's not a decision that the Para board made. Again, it was made by the Colorado legislature, and that law is in place. So we would, again, facilitate divestment as mandated by the legislature or the federal government.
Thank you. And as a reminder, if you'd like to be placed in the phone queue for questions, please press *3 to ask your question. And we have one more investment question. The question is from Tom, who wants to know how inflation has affected Para.
So that's a great question. Again, we are invested in all the markets. So to the extent that there is pricing power associated with inflationary times, which as consumers we know there is, the company's revenues that we're invested in would likely increase. So broadly speaking, we have exposure to inflation sensitive types of investments. Now, if you think about our fixed income portfolio, which is roughly 23% strategic target, that inflation generally negatively impacts bonds. And so we have seen some pressure in the bond markets and our bond market returns. Obviously, we've seen pressure in the equity market returns as well. So, generally speaking, we have positive correlation to inflation in certain of our investments and then negative with the fixed income markets. Again, we're not trying to time the markets at the top-down total funds level. All that is to say, though, individual portfolios and portfolio managers may be making decisions to hedge their portfolio against inflation, whether that's gaining exposure to commodities, which may experience more inflation than the rest of the market. That could be happening, but we are not at the top-down level trying to hedge inflation within the portfolio. Inflation is something that is incorporated in our consultants or the board's consultants' capital market assumptions. And so inflation is considered from a long-term perspective when we do the asset liability study to develop the strategic asset allocation that I talked about earlier. And so again, that's with a longer-term perspective. So we are seeing some near-term inflation, which is, as a consumer, again, not great. But over the longer periods, we would expect inflation to be more normalized, and that would be included in all the asset class assumptions that we've used to develop that strategic asset allocation. Hopefully that helps with that question.
Okay. And Mr. Baker, I believe this will be a question for you. Gary is online with a question about Para benefits. Gary, you are live on our town hall.
I'd like to know where Para ranks across the nation with other public employee retirement programs, benefits, and that type of thing. At one time, I know Para was in the top 3, but I don't know where we are now.
Thank you, Gary. We have to kind of take this question in pieces. Para is one of about 13 systems in which we are a replacement for Social Security. A number of the other pension systems statewide, teacher systems, are a supplement to Social Security in a number of other states. So the benefits that are provided by Para are intended to, again, be a replacement for Social Security. So they are, the apples-to-apples comparison is in a smaller universe of plans. Plans that are a supplement are not providing nearly the same multiplier. Your years times 2.5 might be years times 1.25, which means the benefit on the other end of it is obviously smaller because you are a supplement versus a replacement for. So in the realm of the benefit plans that are similar to us, true replacement for Social Security, we are comparable. We really have some features that are unique to Para that allow us to stack up very well in terms of members who are in the system for shorter windows of time. There's a argument made that defined benefit programs similar to Para are only valuable to plans or to a person who works a long-term career. And that is certainly true that the longer that you work, certainly the replacement of your benefit is solid. But Para's got we had a question earlier about the matching dollars and the interest that Para gives on accounts. There's a feature inside Para's plan that allows us to give the higher of that typical DB formula of your years of service times a multiplier times your salary, and actually do what we call a money purchase, which is a fancy way to say we take all of the money in your account, including matching dollars and interest, and we annuitize it and come up with a benefit amount. And what that really allows is for somebody who works a shorter career, for somebody who leaves public service, starts at 25, works for 10 years, leaves at 35, that they can leave their account at Para, and when they reach an eligibility date 20 years into the future, they've not lost value of their benefit over the inflationary period of when their salary was earned. We're actually taking those dollars that we've been paying, matching dollars and interest on over all that time, and building a benefit. That is really one of the hidden power of Para's benefit structure, and which makes us really unique in the public pension space. There aren't very many. In fact, I'm not sure there are any that have the better of the two options. It allows us to ensure that we are competitive for a long-term employee or a short-term employee. When you start your career, if you started in your 20s or you started in your 50s, you're working in public service, the Para benefit as a replacement of the time that you were spent in public service is a very strong benefit. I couldn't give you a ranking top three, but our benefits are very good and very strong, and intended to provide security and retirement for the public workforce, no matter how long you were in the public workforce.
Right. Thank you for that answer. And now we have a question for our town hall audience. So Para is always seeking ways to modernize how our members interact with us. And if Para had a smartphone app that allowed you to see important account information or submit paperwork or contact us directly without calling, would you be interested in downloading that app? Press 1 if you would use a smartphone app to do business with Para. Press 2 if you aren't sure. And press 3 if you would not use a smartphone app to do business with Para. Again, if you would use the app to do business with Para, press 1 for yes, 2 if you're unsure, and 3 if it's a no. And we'll share those results at the end of the program. Okay, we have one more question from Barbara. And with the excessive inflation, why are retirees only receiving a 1% increase? We should be staying up with inflation like Social Security. What's going on?
Again, thank you for the question. The Para plan design is again, we replace them for Social Security, but the benefit that is earned by Para members is far stronger than what is earned in Social Security. The amounts that you earn are not capped like they are in Social Security in terms of salary being used. So yes, it is all part of a different benefit structure. The Para plan design is not exactly like Social Security, that is looking at CPI and addressing CPI in any given year. It cuts, to be perfectly honest, both ways. There have been years in which there's been low inflation and Social Security paid at 0 and Para paid 2%, 1.5, different benefit annual increase amounts. Certainly do understand that in this current environment that the Para's design, where we're paying 1% on increases, is not keeping up with the current inflationary numbers. But in the past, they've exceeded the inflationary numbers, and it is, small solace. I do understand in terms of keeping up with inflation where it stands now, but they're just two separate animals. The Social Security system is not what Para is designed to be, and the way that increases are paid are not similar across the two systems. They serve two different purposes, and that's why they are not in lockstep. I know, certainly looking at Social Security, it has one answer. Again, looking at it a different window of time, Para certainly paid better increases than Social Security did at that time.
And Mr. Baker, Nick on the phone has a follow-up question about the 1%. Nick, you are live.
Good morning. Regarding the 1% cost of living adjustment, does that have a sunset provision, and or are there benchmarks built in that change when the cost of living adjustment increases from 1%?
Thank you for that question. That is a really good question. I appreciate you asking. Yes, the 1%, there are benchmarks, but I call them guardrails, that are put in place that Para's that is measured to modify the amount of that annual increase or the contributions coming in. So yes, there is an opportunity for that amount to increase. back up to the 2% that was in place at the time that Senate Bill 200 was passed back in 2018. It would take that Para's funding has reached a level in which we are, I kind of frame it as ahead of paying off by 2047 at a fairly substantial amount. So it is, the guidelines inside the legislation allowed that if Para were to get ahead of paying off that by that 2047 date, we can begin to increase the amount of the annual amounts that are paid to our retirees and decrease the amount of the contributions that we need to receive from our employers and our active members. The other avenue is, of course, when we got behind the curve, we would end up reducing the amount that we pay to our benefit recipients and increasing the amount that we're taking in terms of the active members paying into the system and their employers. So yes, there are mechanisms. The math of it is kind of complex under the covers, but there is a guardrails put into the system to allow us to automatically have the annual increase go up if we were to find ourselves in a better funded position.
Mr. Baker, Alfred online has a question. He wants to know if Para is still financially sound.
Thank you, Alfred. Yes, Para is financially sound. We are underfunded, for sure. And I want to make that statement that we're financially sound. We do need to keep monitoring the fact that we're not 100% funded. We need to stay steady in the course of paying down that unfunded liability. Certainly, there is not any alarm in which we would not be able to pay benefits in any given year based on current circumstances, but it is always something that until we are fully funded, and even then, it's something you need to continue to monitor going forward. But Para has, the General Assembly has ensured that Para has never missed making the payments to its membership and has made changes to our plan design and our contributions to ensure that going forward. They did it in 2010, they've done it in 2018 when the need arose. So yes, Para is secure, but that is not that we know this for the end of time. This is something that we always need to monitor. We need to check on, report back to the General Assembly, and ensure that we keep the folks who are receiving benefits continuing to receive those benefits.
And Ms. McGarity, Joe online has a question about, does Para follow the ESG guidelines in its investment strategy, and to what extent?
Great, thanks for that question. So there are two avenues with which I will try to answer this question. So one of our competitive advantages here at Para is that we manage the majority of our assets internally, especially on the public market side. We manage 100% of our fixed income portfolio or bonds internally, and about 65-ish% of our equity portfolio internally. So that means that Para staff are making decisions on buying and selling those underlying securities. The rest of the portfolio is outsourced, however. And so I can't speak to their individual policies, although I can assure you that each of the other managers, external managers, is taking into consideration all factors that they believe will influence expected long-term returns of their investments. For Para staff, first I wanted to plug our investment stewardship report, which this is our 5th year in producing that report, and we think it's a very effective way to engage with Para stakeholders, including our members, on how we invest the portfolio and how we advocate for lower fees, stronger markets, more transparency, et cetera. So you could find a lot of information about how we think about managing the portfolio in our stewardship report, which is available online. In addition, we'll be hosting one of these events, like a Facebook Live event sometime in August, to be determined, where you can engage with our Director of Investment Stewardship and talk to her about specific questions that you might have. As it relates to how Para internal staff consider ESG and other factors in the investment of the portfolio, I would characterize it as we analyze all factors which we think will have material financial impact on a company's results. So what that means is, if a company we think within our investment time horizon is positively or negatively influenced by any number of factors, including E, S, and G, that may guide or go into our investment decision-making process. That said, not all companies have the same drivers of returns. And so if it's a company that doesn't have exposure to environmental issues, for example, that may not rise to the top of what is included in our underlying analysis. Our fiduciary responsibility is to strive for the best risk-adjusted returns for our membership. And so again, to the extent that E, S, or G rise to the top as to a factor that will go to contributing or detracting from our expected long-term returns of a particular security, that will be included in the analysis. Hopefully that answers your question, but thanks for that one.
Okay, and Mr. Baker, William on the phone has a question regarding health benefits. William, you are live. William, you're live at the town hall.
Yeah, I was wondering, is Paracare looking into finding another provider rather than United Healthcare? They're terrible compared to the Anthem Blue Cross that we had before. They deny everything and you have to appeal it. They were cheaper per month, but co-pays on our insurance are higher, or our prescriptions are higher. So, you know, it ends up probably costing more per month than we were with Anthem Blue Cross. And it seems like, you know, for any medical things that your doctors recommend, you just don't get the service from United Healthcare that we did from Anthem.
Thank you for the question. We're in agreement with United for a window of time, and I'm sorry to hear that your experience with United has not been as good as it was with Anthem. But certainly in the plan design, when we made the switch, it was for lower premiums, for equal coverage. And in fact, we have had the premiums across the board be comparable or lower by moving over to United. And our intent was for the benefits to be comparable or better. So to the extent that they are not for you, I would ask to get your information or have you get in touch with our insurance department to talk about the individual specifics of where you're paying more and related to that. But certainly when we made that change a year ago, it was because the cost to the benefit recipients was better under United than it is under Anthem.
Okay, and Mr. Baker, this is a question from Judy online for you. Have membership levels changed in the last 5 years?
Thank you for that question. In fact, membership levels have not grown at the pace that they had been growing prior. Public service is growing, yes, but it is not growing at the pace that it had previously. And that has an impact when we're using the contributions on payroll as the funding mechanism to bring down unfunded liability. One of the reasons that we are at the 1% annual increase in this July is related to the fact that the board, looking at the assumptions of and the experience of our plan over the last 4 years, saw that simply in all of our divisions, there wasn't the growth that was expected, both from a payroll perspective or from a headcount perspective. And that has an impact. So when the board modified their assumptions to reflect what we're seeing in public service, it did increase the time to pay down the liabilities because we're simply, and again, not seeing the growth that we expected. So yes, public service as a whole is not growing at the pace it has in the past. It is growing. Now, the anomaly that we're all dealing with is that impact year of 2020 and a bit of 2021 as we are working through the pandemic and its impact on public service. Certainly in 2020, we saw a dramatic drop in the number of active state employees and school districts at both our school division and DPS division. Simply, I think as we went to remote teaching, there was a number of staff members that are not related to remote teaching that dropped on that side of it. We're seeing a bounce back, certainly in the schools. The state has stayed fairly flat as it's come out of the pandemic. We'll know more over time as to what the long-term impact of the pandemic was on the growth of public employment at both the state level and the schools level. We also have two other divisions that we cover, which are units of local government and judges. We are also seeing less growth in both of those as well. So public employment is just, again, it's not shrinking, but it is not growing at the pace it has previously.
And Mr. Baker, we have a similar question on Facebook. Mark from Clearwater, Florida wants to know if the underfunding that was in place 10 years ago when he retired, did it increase or did it happen because Para merged with Denver Public Schools?
As much as I could to kid around and blame Amy because she mentioned that she came from Denver Public Schools retirement system, and I could put it all on her feet. It is not at all that. The divisions across Para, from an actuarial perspective, from the perspective of measuring whether or not we're fully funded, are separate entities. So the inclusion of Denver Public Schools was additive to Para in terms of, at least to the state of Colorado. It allowed teachers to flow back and forth and not have an artificial barrier to teaching in one district and then moving to the Denver Public Schools. And we're measuring the impact across each of those divisional trust funds independently of each other. The paying down of the unfunded liability over the last decade, and Amy had mentioned how strong the investment markets over that 10-year window are also related to the demographic side. So we have made progress, but not maybe as much progress as we would have hoped, because people are living longer, which longer and longer time paying benefits also increases unfunded liability over time. The growth numbers in terms of employment and salary growth, changes in benefits. The long-term rate of return assumption that the board adopts, looking at what comes from their investment consultants, has dropped from at 10 years ago at 8% to now to 7.25%. That is a discount rate. Again, math under the covers, it gets to unfunded liability. So there are a lot of reasons why we are where we are in terms of unfunded. We are making progress, but it is a long track to get to that 2047 fully funded date. But no, it is not the inclusion of Denver Public Schools retirement system in 2010 with that merger that has had a negative impact on Para's financials. In fact, I'd say again, we're administering that retirement plan, and the fact that we now don't have an artificial barrier to membership movement and retirement has been actually a boon to the education system in the state of Colorado over the last decade. And certainly, from a personal perspective, this organization, we received a lot of DPSRS members or employees onto our staff who are still here. Ms. McGarity being a large part of that contingent that has come in here and made an excellent impact to the membership of Colorado Para.
Mr. Baker, we have another school-related question online. Nancy would like to know if retired subs working for a school district are able to work over 110-day limit for 2022 if they are not in a rural school district.
Thank you for that question. Well, it is nuanced. Yes, for the next 2 years, the General Assembly passed a bill for non-rural school districts. We'll get into why it was non versus rural, but for the non-rural school districts, the General Assembly passed a bill that's sunset in July of 2025 that does allow teachers to go back in retirement and work with no 110-day limit to their benefit. It was done to address the teacher shortage in the non-rural school districts over a window of time impacted by the shortage that we're seeing coming through the pandemic. So yes, over this window, there is an ability to do that in the non-rural school districts. The rural school districts, this bill had passed, a similar bill had passed a few years ago, allowing again, with the sunset idea behind it, that the teachers in the rural school districts, that the retirees working for a rural school district would be able to work without reduction in their para benefit. The General Assembly this year modified that to take away that sunset and make it a permanent ability for folks inside certain positions inside rural school districts to have a retiree work without limitation on their benefit in terms of the 110-day rule. But for non-rural school districts, it is a window of time, and the sunset is currently set to July 1st, 2025.
Okay, and Mr. Baker, Sylvia on the telephone has a follow-up question regarding working after retirement. Sylvia, you are live with the town hall.
Good morning. I continue to work for the state under the rules stipulated by PARA. I also continue to contribute to PARA at the same rate as a non-retired member would. My question is, why do these contributions not affect my benefits in any way?
Happy to that the working retiree contribution that you are referring to was put into place during one of the last set of pension reforms, and it was intended to ensure that those dollars are being used, that the contributions that you are paying down unfunded liability, and the employer contributions to those are paying down unfunded liability. We get this question a lot, which speaks to, if that's the case, why have the limits on 110 days, and why not allow retirees to work unlimited? Because you're receiving contributions that are not increasing my benefit. And the reason it's an expense to PARA to allow somebody to retire and then come back and work without limitation in terms of the limit is because it incents people to retire earlier, and therefore PARA is even though we are not we are getting those contributions, we are paying out a benefit longer. And kind of the math of it I get to is that if somebody retires, and let's just kind of use round numbers, at a 75%, or let's call it a 50% benefit, 20 years in the system, retires, and so we're paying a benefit at 50% of their annual salary going forward. They retire earlier than they would have otherwise because they have the ability to go right back to that job and work without limits. We are receiving 20% of contributions on the salary that we're paying 50% of the benefit on. We lose in that, the PARA system loses in that model because we are paying more out in benefits to somebody than we're getting for the makeup of contributions. If that person did not retire earlier at 20 years and continue to work, we would be receiving the contributions without making that payment stream of the 50% of the benefit. And that difference between what you're earning in terms of additional pay on your future benefit is not more than we're paying out. So it really just comes down to a straight math problem of having people not have a limit allows them to retire at the earliest possible moment. I don't know why you wouldn't. If there was no limit in how long you could retire, receive a benefit, and go right back and be paid full salary without any limitation, who wouldn't take that deal? It is a cost of the system moving forward. So the reason it doesn't add to your benefit is it was part of the pension reforms that were put in place in 2010 to address the fact that working retirees were actually an impact to the system because we were not receiving contribution for a working retiree.
Okay, thank you. And online, Michelle has a question about pre-Medicare monthly premiums are getting very expensive. Is there any talk about increasing the subsidy so those of us that are younger can consider retirement?
Thank you for the question. We don't talk an awful lot, or at least in our reports, we give them out for sure, but it's not as well known. I guess I say, we do have two healthcare trust funds that are being used to fund the subsidy that are given to pre-Medicare. The amounts of, and Medicare benefit recipients, that $115 or $230 a month subsidy at the max end of it, comes out of the healthcare trust funds. Those healthcare trust funds are in the same investment pool as the others, and we have an unfunded liability in those as well. And so an increase to the amount that we would pay out in those subsidies would increase the unfunded liability. So I would not see that the General Assembly, again, the amount of the subsidies is set by the General Assembly, would be necessarily looking to increase those subsidy amounts until the unfunded liability is settled in both those healthcare trust funds. In fact, the PARA board has a funding policy that says they would oppose any increases in benefits until those funds are fully funded. So I understand that, yes, those have been a locked-in amount and they're not moving forward through time as healthcare costs grow. But that is, again, being paid out of a healthcare trust fund that is not fully funded. And to increase liabilities on that healthcare trust fund, increase the amount of time that the employers are paying additional contributions into the PARA system to pay down that unfunded liability.
Thank you. Ms. McGarity, Michael on the telephone has a question about investing after retirement. Michael, you are live with the town hall.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my question is, like many PERA retirees, I do a little small-time investing. Small would be the operable word there. And I have watched with big eyes at how well you have done investing our funds there, and have wondered over the years whether it wouldn't really be quite a benefit for you to use the same expertise you have, the same blueprint on the funds that you already invest, to start a fund under the PERA 401k auspices that basically mirrors the investments of our fund. I would certainly feel a lot more confident about your intentions than some fund manager in New York City.
Wow, I'm going to save that and record it and save it for myself when I need a pep talk. But thank you so much for that question. And the credit goes to, first of all, the board's strategic asset allocation that is, in excess of 80% of what drives our overall returns. So that thoughtful process has yielded strong returns over periods of time, and that is really due to the board's process and thoughtful approach. The PERA team here of about 60 professionals in investments is also grateful for your really kind remarks. One of the projects that we have been working on over the past couple of years is what we're calling unitization, which would essentially be, you could correlate it with a mutual fund in essence, that we think ultimately we can try to offer the defined benefit plan investments to defined contribution plan participants. You may know that Colorado PERA oversees also defined contribution investments. We have a 401k, a 457, and a DC plan, and the PERA team oversees those investments. We do actually manage several portfolios for those investments, including a US large cap, an international, a small cap, and shortly a fixed income fund for those participants. And they are managing those assets in actually very similar ways, if not exactly identically, that they are for the defined benefit plan, for the benefit of those defined contribution participants at a much lower cost than those participants could obtain in the market. So we do think that has a real compelling value proposition for those participants, and hope to continue to leverage those internal management skills in the defined contribution space going forward, and are actively working to do so. So thank you for those comments.
Okay, our results are in for the poll. For those of you who joined maybe a little bit later, the question was, would you use a smartphone app that allowed you to do business with PERA? So if we could show those results now.
We can keep them secret.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll come back to the poll results and we'll take another question while we wait for those to come up. So Janet online would like to know if PERA can divest from fossil fuels.
Yeah, I'll take that one. And Ron, if you have anything that you'd like to add, please feel free to chime in. But I talked earlier when the question about Ben & Jerry's came earlier in the conversation, that the board has a philosophy statement surrounding divestment, that we will execute divestment as mandated by the state or federal governments, but otherwise choose not to invest. And the reason for that is we believe allowing the investors, either internal or external, the broadest possible universe from which to choose investments enables us to outperform for the long term. So as you can imagine, if you take fossil fuels as an example, that is a very volatile market. And so I think fossil fuel or energy broadly within the global equity markets is up over 20% year to date. And so to make the decision, the PERA board to make the decision to divest of fossil fuels, the potential opportunity cost for any given sector is quite large, and not everyone shares the same perspectives. Not that the PERA board or staff are in denial of climate change and may personally choose other ways to invest their portfolio, but generally speaking, we have taken the approach that we would really work better under having the broadest possible universe from which to choose our investments. And if I could add, if you are a participant in our defined contribution plans, there is an option that is called a SRI fund, or socially responsible investment fund, that has exposure to both global equities and bonds, fixed income, that is socially screened. And so that may be an opportunity for people who are interested in dedicating their investments to those lines of philosophy. That is an option for them, as well as the self-directed brokerage option, where people can choose their own underlying investments and can avoid certain sectors or stocks or bonds, et cetera, to their own accord. So thanks for that question.
Okay, and we do have the poll results in. 485 people have voted, and 39% said yes, they would use a smartphone app, and 24% were unsure, and 37% said no, they would not want to use a smartphone app. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. We appreciate that feedback, and we have time for one more question before we close our town hall meeting today. Okay. Okay, so Johan online has a question that President Biden recently made a statement that assistance may be available for distressed pension funds. Does that impact PARA?
Thank you for the question. No, it does not. He was speaking of a different set of pension funds than the public pension systems that we are part of.
Thank you very much for that answer. And thank you for joining us on the town hall. That's all the time we have for our town hall this morning. A recording of the town hall will be available at copara.org/townhall. And before we go, just a couple of reminders. If you need specific help with your PARA account, you can contact our customer service call center at 1-800-759-7372. You can also send a secure message through your member portal on copara.org. And if you'd like to stay in touch with PARA, you can follow PARA on the Issues, which is our online blog, as well as follow us on social media. So you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. And thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great morning.